My name is Martha, and I'm 32 years old. 2 years ago, after my divorce, I moved back into my childhood home in Riverside with my 8-year-old daughter, Emma, and 6-year-old son, Jake. My parents, Harold and Agnes, welcomed us with open arms, and honestly, it felt like a blessing. While I worked night shifts at the hospital, they'd help with homework, make dinner, and tuck my babies into bed. I was saving every penny for our own place, dreaming of the day we'd have our independence back. But then my brother Gerald showed up after 5 years of silence, and everything I thought I knew about family loyalty was about to crumble. Before I dive into what happened next, let me know where you're watching from, and don't forget to hit that like button and subscribe. Trust me, you're going to want to hear how this family drama unfolds, because what my parents did to my children will shock you, but my response will leave you cheering. The path that led me back to my childhood home wasn't one I'd planned. 2 years earlier, my marriage to David had imploded in the messiest way possible. He'd been having an affair with his secretary for months, and when I finally confronted him, he didn't even try to deny it. Instead, he packed his bags and left Emma, Jake, and me with nothing but a mountain of debt and broken promises. The divorce proceedings dragged on for 8 grueling months, during which David disappeared completely. No child support, no phone calls to check on his kids, nothing. It was like he'd erased us from his life entirely. As a registered nurse at Riverside General, I was making decent money but not nearly enough to cover rent, childcare, and all the expenses that come with raising 2 young children alone. My parents, Harold and Agnes, had always been supportive, but when they offered for us to move back into my old room, I initially resisted. At 29, moving back home felt like admitting defeat. But Emma needed stability, and Jake was struggling with his father's abandonment. The decision became clear when I found Jake crying in his room one night, asking me why Daddy didn't love him anymore. The house on Maple Street was the same 2-story colonial I'd grown up in, with its faded blue shutters and the old oak tree in the front yard where I'd spent countless summer afternoons reading. Dad had converted the garage into a workshop where he restored antique furniture, and Mom still maintained her prize-winning rose garden that was the envy of the neighborhood. When we moved in, Emma got my old room with its window seat overlooking the garden, while Jake settled into what used to be the guest room. Mom had even put up new curtains and bought them each a bookshelf. Those first months were actually wonderful. Dad would sit with Emma every evening after dinner, teaching her to play chess on the board he'd carved himself decades ago. She was a quick learner, and his face would light up every time she made a smart move. Mom, meanwhile, had Jake helping her in the kitchen, letting him measure ingredients and stir batter for her famous chocolate chip cookies. He'd stand on the little wooden stool she'd bought just for him, his tongue sticking out in concentration as he tried to crack eggs without getting shells in the bowl. I worked mostly night shifts, which meant I was home during the day to help with homework and take them to school while my parents handled the evening routine. It was the kind of support system every single mother dreams of. Emma's grades improved dramatically, and Jake's teachers commented on how much happier and more focused he seemed. For the first time since the divorce, I felt like we were healing as a family. The best part was watching my children develop real relationships with their grandparents. Dad taught Emma card games and showed her how to use his woodworking tools safely. She made him a pencil holder in his workshop, sanding it carefully and painting it bright yellow because she said it reminded her of sunshine. Mom shared her love of gardening with Jake, giving him his own small plot where he grew radishes and sunflowers. Every morning he'd run out to check on his plants before breakfast, reporting their progress to anyone who'd listen. I was diligent about saving money, putting away every extra dollar I could manage. My goal was to have enough for a down payment on a small house within 2 years. I'd found a modest 3-bedroom ranch about 10 minutes away that would be perfect for us. The owner was a retired teacher who'd promised to let me know before putting it on the market. I had already started researching mortgage options and had even gotten pre-approved for a loan. The independence felt so close I could taste it, but I wasn't in any rush. My kids were happy, my parents seemed to enjoy having us around, and for the first time in years, life felt stable and predictable. Everything changed on a drizzly Thursday evening in March, when Gerald's silver BMW pulled into our driveway. I was in the kitchen helping Jake with his math homework when I heard the familiar sound of Dad's booming voice saying, "Well, I'll be damned," through the front window. Gerald stood on our porch in an expensive charcoal suit, his wife Patricia beside him in designer jeans and heels that probably cost more than my monthly grocery budget. Behind them was their 7-year-old son, Leo, dressed like he'd stepped out of a Ralph Lauren catalog. It had been 5 years since I'd last seen my older brother. We'd never been particularly close growing up, and after he graduated from college with his business degree, he'd moved to the city and rarely looked back. He'd missed Dad's 65th birthday mom's retirement party and hadn't even sent a card when I got divorced. His absence had hurt my parents more than they'd ever admitted, though Mom would occasionally mention how successful he was in real estate, as if making excuses for his neglect. Gerald's entrance into our living room felt like a performance. He hugged Mom with theatrical enthusiasm, clapped Dad on the back, and made a big show of introducing Patricia as if we hadn't met her at their wedding 6 years ago. Leo stood quietly beside his parents, his posture perfect, his hands clasped behind his back like he'd been trained for formal occasions. When Gerald finally acknowledged me, it was with a patronizing smile and a comment about how domestic life seemed to suit me. Patricia and I have been talking about how important family connections are for Leo's development, Gerald announced, settling into Dad's favorite armchair like he owned the place. We want him to know his roots to understand where he comes from. Patricia nodded approvingly, her perfectly manicured fingers smoothing Leo's already perfect hair. We've been so focused on Leo's enrichment activities that we realized we've neglected the family aspect of his upbringing. Leo, they explained, was enrolled in advanced mathematics, spoke conversational French, played violin at a near professional level, and was already reading at a high school level, despite being only 7. Patricia pulled out her phone to show us videos of him performing at recitals and receiving awards at academic competitions. His tutor says he has the potential to skip multiple grades, she said with obvious pride. But we want to make sure he stays well-rounded and connected to his extended family. I watched my parents' faces during this presentation, seeing how impressed they were becoming with each revelation about Leo's accomplishments. Dad kept shaking his head in amazement, saying things like, 7 years old and reading Shakespeare. That's incredible. Mom was practically glowing as Patricia described Leo's refined palate and his preference for classical music over cartoons. It was clear that my nephew was everything they'd always dreamed a grandchild could be, polite, accomplished, and sophisticated. Emma and Jake, meanwhile, sat on the couch, looking increasingly uncomfortable. When Gerald asked Emma what grade she was in, she mumbled her answer and looked at the floor. Jake tried to show Leo his collection of toy cars, but Leo politely declined, explaining that he was more interested in educational activities. The contrast between my children's casual, kid-like behavior and Leo's adult-like composure was stark and obviously not lost on my parents. As the evening wore on, the conversation kept circling back to Leo's achievements. Gerald described the private tutors, the music lessons, the language immersion programs. Patricia talked about their plans for Leo's future, the prep schools. They were considering the Ivy League universities they were already researching. It was impressive, certainly, but there was something cold about the way they discussed their son's life, like it was a business plan rather than a childhood. When bedtime came, Emma and Jake hugged their grandparents goodnight as usual, but the hugs seemed shorter, less enthusiastic than normal. Leo shook hands formally with everyone, even the adults, and thanked my parents for their hospitality in a voice that sounded rehearsed. After they left, Mom spent 20 minutes telling me how impressed she was with Leo's manners and how lucky Gerald was to have such a gifted child. Dad just kept shaking his head and repeating, 7 years old Martha. Can you believe it? What started as occasional visits soon became a regular weekly occurrence. Every Sunday, Gerald's BMW would pull into our driveway, and Leo would emerge with a new accomplishment to share. One week he'd mastered a particularly challenging piece on his violin. The next he'd won another academic competition or completed an advanced workbook meant for children twice his age. Gerald always had professional photographs of these achievements printed on expensive paper and presented in leather portfolios that he'd leave with my parents to admire throughout the week. The gifts started subtly. Gerald would bring Dad books about antique furniture that cost more than I spent on groceries in a month. He'd present Mom with exotic orchids for her garden, explaining their complex care requirements, like he was bestowing precious treasures. For the house, there were expensive candles, gourmet coffee wine that he'd research extensively before purchasing. Each gift came with a story about where he'd found it, how much research had gone into the selection, how perfect it was for their refined tastes. I began to notice changes in my parents' behavior during our daily routines. When Emma struggled with her third-grade multiplication tables, Dad would sigh and mention how Leo was already working on algebra. When Jake got excited about a picture he'd drawn at school, Mom would look at it politely, but then launch into a story about the oil painting Leo had completed in his art class. The comparisons weren't mean-spirited, but they were constant and impossible to ignore. Dinner time became particularly uncomfortable. What had once been casual family conversations about our days turned into showcases for Leo's latest achievements. Dad would read aloud from emails Gerald sent during the week detailing Leo's progress in various subjects. Mom would show us photos Patricia had texted of Leo's latest musical performance or academic award. Emma started eating faster, asking to be excused as soon as possible. Jake began playing with his food, building little sculptures on his plate instead of engaging in conversation. The most painful changes happened during what used to be special one-on-one time with their grandparents. Dad's chess lessons with Emma became exercises in frustration as he'd constantly reference how quickly Leo had mastered various strategies. "Leo learned this opening in just 2 sessions," he'd say, when Emma struggled with a new concept. "Maybe you need to practice more, sweetheart." Mom's baking sessions with Jake turned into lectures about precision and following directions punctuated by stories about Leo's natural ability in the kitchen and his sophisticated palate. I tried talking to my parents about the comparisons, but they brushed off my concerns. "We're not comparing," Mom insisted. "We're just excited about Leo's achievements. There's nothing wrong with celebrating excellence." Dad nodded in agreement, adding, "Maybe seeing what Leo can accomplish will motivate Emma and Jake to work harder. A little healthy competition never hurt anyone." But it was hurting someone. Emma's confidence, which had been building so beautifully since we'd moved in, began to crumble. She stopped raising her hand in class and started bringing home assignments with lower grades. When I asked her teachers about it, they said she seemed distracted and would often claim she wasn't smart enough to understand the material. Jake's joyful, energetic personality dimmed. He stopped running out to check on his garden every morning, and when I asked him about it, he shrugged and said his plants were probably not as good as Leo's would be. The breaking point came during what should have been a celebration of Emma's report card. She'd brought home mostly B's with an A in reading, which was a significant improvement from her struggles earlier in the year. I was proud of her effort and growth, but when I showed the report card to my parents, Dad barely glanced at it before saying, "That's nice, dear. Gerald sent us Leo's progress report yesterday, all A+ scores, and his teacher recommended him for the gifted program next year." That night I found Emma crying in her room, her report card crumpled on the floor. When I asked what was wrong, she looked up at me with tears streaming down her face and said, "Mommy, why am I so stupid compared to Leo? Grandpa and Grandma love him more because he's smarter." My heart broke into 1,000 pieces as I gathered her into my arms, trying to find words to repair damage I hadn't fully realized was happening. The situation escalated dramatically when Gerald mentioned almost casually during one of his Sunday visits that their house was undergoing major renovations. "The contractors found some structural issues that need to be addressed," he explained to my parents over coffee in the living room. "We're looking at about 6 weeks of work, maybe 8 if they run into more problems. Patricia's been stressed about finding suitable temporary housing that won't disrupt Leo's routine too much." Before Gerald had even finished speaking, both of my parents were practically jumping over each other to offer solutions. "You should stay here," Dad declared immediately. We have plenty of room, and Leo could experience what it's like to be part of a big family. Mom nodded enthusiastically already, mentally rearranging bedrooms and planning meals. It would be wonderful to have more time with our grandson, she added, not seeming to notice how the word our stung when applied exclusively to Leo. I felt a knot forming in my stomach as I listened to this conversation unfold. Our house wasn't exactly spacious, and adding 3 more people would create obvious logistical challenges. But more than that, I could already envision how this arrangement would affect Emma and Jake, who were still struggling with the weekly visits and constant comparisons. However, when I gently suggested that the house might be a bit crowded with everyone, my concern was immediately dismissed. "Nonsense," Gerald said with a wave of his hand. "We're family. Families make sacrifices for each other." Patricia smiled sweetly and added, "Leo is so adaptable, and this will be such a valuable experience for him to see how different generations live together." The decision was made without any real consideration of how it might impact my children or our established routines. The first week of their stay began innocently enough, but the dynamic shifted quickly. Emma was asked to give up her room so that Leo could have adequate space for his studies and practice sessions. "Leo needs quiet for his violin practice and his tutoring sessions," Patricia explained as she directed Gerald to move Emma's furniture into Jake's smaller room. "I hope you understand, Emma. We'll make this up to you somehow." Jake's room, which had been his sanctuary, filled with his drawings and toy cars, suddenly felt cramped and chaotic with Emma's belongings squeezed in alongside his own. The children tried to adapt, but sharing a room meant Emma couldn't read before bed without disturbing Jake, and Jake couldn't play with his cars without bothering Emma's homework time. Their carefully established bedtime routine, which had been one of the few constants since the divorce, became a nightly struggle. Leo's presence transformed our house's entire atmosphere. His violin practice sessions filled the halls with classical music from 7 to 8 every morning, eliminating any possibility of sleeping in on weekends. His tutoring sessions with Patricia took place in what used to be our family room, meaning Emma and Jake couldn't watch their usual after-school cartoons or play their board games. Even mealtimes changed as Mom began preparing more sophisticated dishes to accommodate Leo's refined palate, replacing the simple comfort foods my children loved. The most painful part was watching my parents' complete absorption in Leo's daily routine. They would sit quietly during his practice sessions, whispering about his technique and musicality. They attended his tutoring sessions like private performances, marveling at his advanced mathematical skills and his ability to discuss literature like a college student. Emma and Jake became background figures in their own home, expected to be quiet during Leo's activities and grateful for any attention left over. When I tried to establish some boundaries, suggesting that perhaps Leo could practice in the basement, or that we could designate certain hours for family activities that included all the children, my suggestions were met with resistance. "Leo's education can't be disrupted," Patricia stated firmly. "Surely Emma and Jake can adjust their schedules around his needs. It's only temporary after all." Gerald nodded in agreement, adding that my children could learn valuable lessons about discipline and focus by observing Leo's dedicated approach to his studies. 3 weeks into their stay, I was assigned a double shift at the hospital when one of my colleagues called in sick with pneumonia. I'd be working from 6 in the evening until 10 the next morning, covering both the night shift and the early morning hours. It wasn't unusual for me to work extended hours, but I always made sure my parents knew my schedule and felt comfortable managing Emma and Jake's routines in my absence. Before leaving for work that evening, I went through our usual checklist with Mom. Emma had a book report due the next day that she'd finished but wanted to review one more time. Jake had soccer practice after school and needed his cleats, which were drying in the mudroom after yesterday's rainy practice. I reminded Mom about Emma's mild allergy to strawberries since she'd mentioned wanting to try a new fruit salad recipe, and confirmed that both children's bedtime stories were bookmarked in their respective favorite books. "Don't worry about a thing," Mom assured me, giving me the same confident smile she'd been giving me since childhood whenever I had concerns about anything. "Harold and I raised you and Gerald just fine, didn't we? We know how to take care of children." Dad nodded from his armchair, looking up from the evening newspaper to add, "Go on, Martha. Do your job, and trust us to do ours. The kids will be fine." I kissed Emma and Jake goodbye, reminding them to be good for Grandma and Grandpa, and promising to take them for ice cream after school the next day if the weather was nice. Emma hugged me tightly as she always did before my night shifts and whispered, "Come home soon, Mommy." Jake wrapped his little arms around my waist and made me promise to check on them when I got home, even if they were sleeping. These goodbye rituals had become precious to me, small reassurances that despite all the changes in our living situation, our bond remained strong. The hospital was unusually busy that night with 3 emergency surgeries and a constant stream of patients in the ER. I barely had time to grab coffee between rounds, let alone think about what was happening at home. During my brief break around 3 in the morning, I did text Mom to check that everything was okay, and she responded immediately that all the children were sleeping peacefully and not to worry about anything. What I didn't know was that while I was caring for patients at the hospital, a family meeting was taking place in our living room. Gerald and Patricia had approached my parents with what they called a practical solution to the space issues that had been developing over the past few weeks. Leo needed more room for his educational activities, they explained, and the current arrangement wasn't allowing him to reach his full potential. "The basement is finished and perfectly comfortable," Gerald had argued, gesturing toward the lower level that Dad had converted into a rec room years ago. "It's actually larger than the upstairs bedrooms, and Emma and Jake would have more space to spread out down there. Plus, it would give Leo the quiet environment he needs for his advanced studies." Patricia had nodded enthusiastically, adding that this arrangement would benefit everyone by reducing the noise conflicts and scheduling complications they'd all been experiencing. My parents, who had been feeling increasingly stressed about managing the different children's needs and schedules, saw this as a reasonable compromise. "It's just temporary," Mom had reasoned. "Once Gerald's house is finished, everything will go back to normal. And really, the basement is quite nice. We could set up a little apartment down there for the kids." Dad had agreed, thinking about Leo's educational needs and the importance of supporting his grandson's obvious talents. The decision was made without any consideration of how Emma and Jake might feel about being relocated to the basement, or whether they should be consulted about this major change to their living situation. It was framed as a practical solution that would benefit everyone, but in reality it was the first step in officially designating my children as second-class members of our household. I arrived home at 10:30 the next morning, exhausted from the long shift, but looking forward to spending the day with Emma and Jake before they got home from school. The house seemed unusually quiet as I unlocked the front door, and I could hear classical music drifting down from what used to be Emma's room upstairs. I assumed the children were at school and my parents were probably in the kitchen having their usual mid-morning coffee. But as I walked through the living room toward the kitchen, I heard a sound that made my blood run cold. It was Emma's voice, and she was crying. Not the dramatic tears of childhood disappointment, but the deep, heartbroken sobs of a child whose world has been shattered. The sound was coming from below, and with growing dread I followed it to the basement stairs. What I found at the bottom of those stairs will haunt me for the rest of my life. Emma and Jake were sitting on old mattresses that had been dragged down from the attic, surrounded by their belongings, hastily shoved into garbage bags and cardboard boxes. Emma was clutching her favorite stuffed elephant, the one she'd had since she was 3, and crying as if her heart was breaking. Jake was sitting beside her, his arm around her shoulders, trying to be brave, but with tears streaming silently down his cheeks. "Mommy?" Emma cried when she saw me launching herself into my arms with desperate relief. "They said we have to live down here now because Leo needs our rooms. They said Leo is more important because he's smarter and we're just in the way." Her words tumbled out between sobs, each one hitting me like a physical blow. Jake joined us, wrapping his small arms around both Emma and me, and whispered, "Mommy, why don't Grandma and Grandpa love us anymore?" Looking around the basement, I could see that someone had made a minimal effort to make the space livable. There were 2 old mattresses on the floor with mismatched sheets and thin blankets. A small folding table had been set up with a lamp for homework, and their clothes had been hung on a makeshift rod suspended between two pipes. But it was clear that this wasn't meant to be a comfortable living space for children. It was meant to be a place where they could be stored out of the way. As I held my children and tried to process what had happened, I heard footsteps on the stairs above us. Gerald appeared first, followed by Patricia, then my parents. They all looked slightly guilty but also defiant, as if they'd been caught doing something they knew was wrong but refused to admit it. Gerald was the first to speak, his voice taking on the patronizing tone I remembered from our childhood. "Now, Martha, before you get upset, let us explain," he said, holding up his hands as if he were calming an irrational person. "This is actually a much better arrangement for everyone. Leo needs adequate space for his educational activities, and Emma and Jake will have more room down here to play and do their homework without disturbing anyone." Patricia nodded in agreement, her perfectly styled hair not moving as she gestured toward the basement setup. "We've made it quite cozy down here, and really children are so adaptable. They'll adjust quickly, and this way, Leo can maintain his routine without interruption. His tutor is coming this afternoon, and he simply cannot be distracted by noise from other children." But it was my parents' response that truly broke my heart. Mom stepped forward with the same loving expression she'd worn my entire childhood, the one that had always made me feel safe and protected. "Sweetheart, you have to understand Leo is gifted. He has special needs that require special accommodations. Emma and Jake are good children, but they're normal children. Leo has the potential for greatness, and we can't let that be wasted." Dad nodded emphatically. His weathered hands clasped behind his back in the posture he always adopted when he was about to deliver what he considered important wisdom. "Your children need to learn that life isn't always fair, Martha. Sometimes you have to make sacrifices for the greater good. Leo is 7 years old and reading at a 12th grade level. Emma is 8 and still struggling with chapter books. Surely you can see why Leo's education should take priority." As I listened to my parents justify treating my children like second-class citizens in their own home, something fundamental shifted inside me. These were the people who had raised me, who had taught me about love and fairness, and treating all people with dignity. Yet here they stood explaining why my children deserved less consideration than their other grandchild, as if Emma and Jake's worth as human beings was somehow diminished because they weren't academic prodigies. I looked at Emma and Jake still clinging to me, still crying, and made a decision that surprised everyone in that basement, including myself. Instead of arguing or pleading or trying to negotiate a better arrangement, I smiled. It wasn't a happy smile or a sad smile. It was the smile of someone who had just realized something important about her life and was about to act on that realization. "You know what, kids?" I said, my voice calm and steady in a way that made everyone in the room pause and look at me more carefully. "Pack your bags. We're leaving. Today." The silence that followed my announcement was deafening. Gerald was the first to recover his face, shifting from surprise to anger in the space of a heartbeat. "Martha, don't be ridiculous. You're overreacting to a temporary living arrangement. Where exactly do you think you're going to go? You don't have anywhere else to live." But that's where Gerald was wrong, and where the secret I'd been keeping for the past 6 months was about to change everything. While my family had been focused on Leo's achievements and my children's perceived shortcomings, I had been quietly working toward our independence. The house I'd been saving for the modest 3-bedroom ranch I'd told them about months ago had come on the market. Just as I'd hoped it would. I'd already completed the purchase process, signed all the papers, and was scheduled to close tomorrow morning. "Actually, I have exactly somewhere to go," I said, still holding Emma and Jake close to me. "I bought us a house. The closing is tomorrow, but the seller agreed to let us move in today. I've been planning this for months, and frankly, what just happened here has confirmed that I made the right decision." The shocked expressions on their faces would have been comical if the situation weren't so heartbreaking. Patricia was the first to find her voice, though it came out higher and more strained than her usual composed tone. "You can't be serious. You're going to uproot your children and move them to some stranger's house just because Leo needs quiet space to study? That seems incredibly selfish, Martha. Think about what's best for Emma and Jake, not just your wounded pride. The irony of Patricia lecturing me about what was best for my children while they sat crying on mattresses in a basement was so profound that I actually laughed out loud. What's best for my children, I said, looking directly at her, is living somewhere they're valued and loved unconditionally, not somewhere they're treated like inconveniences who should be grateful for whatever scraps of attention they receive. Dad stepped forward. Then his face red with a combination of embarrassment and anger. Now you listen here, young lady. We have given you and your children a home for 2 years. We've supported you, helped raise your kids, and never asked for a dime in return. If you walk out that door over this, don't think you can just come crawling back when reality hits and you realize what you're giving up. The threat in his voice was clear, and I could see that he expected it to make me reconsider, to back down and accept their version of what our family should look like. But instead of fear or uncertainty, all I felt was a profound sense of relief. The decision I'd been agonizing over for months, wondering if I was ready to be completely independent, had just been made incredibly easy. Dad, I said, my voice gentle but firm, I'm not walking out over temporary sleeping arrangements. I'm walking out because you moved my children to the basement without consulting me while I was at work, and then stood here explaining why they deserve less consideration than their cousin. That's not about space or convenience. That's about values. And your values are not the values I want my children to grow up believing. Mom tried a different approach, her eyes filling with tears as she reached toward Emma and Jake. Sweetheart, we love all our grandchildren equally. We were just trying to solve a practical problem. Emma, Jake, tell your mother you don't want to leave Grandma and Grandpa. Tell her you understand we were just trying to help everyone get along. But Emma, still holding tightly to her stuffed elephant, looked up at her grandmother with eyes that seemed far too old for her 8 years. Grandma, she said in a voice barely above a whisper, you told us Leo was more important because he's smarter. You said we should be grateful he wanted to be around kids like us. That doesn't sound like love to me. Jake nodded in agreement, his small voice adding, you said Leo deserved the best rooms because he's special. What does that make us, Grandma? If he's special, are we just regular? Is regular not good enough for you anymore? The questions my children asked cut through all the justifications and explanations, exposing the cruel reality of what had been happening in our house. Gerald and Patricia shifted uncomfortably, perhaps realizing for the first time how their quest to provide Leo with optimal conditions had affected the other children in the family. My parents stood silently, unable to answer their grandchildren's heartbreaking questions. I spent the next 2 hours packing our belongings while my family alternated between trying to convince me I was making a mistake and helping load boxes into my car. Emma and Jake moved through the house like little ghosts, gathering their possessions and saying goodbye to rooms that had been their sanctuary for 2 years. The hardest part was watching Jake kneel beside his abandoned garden plot, touching the soil where his radishes and sunflowers had grown. As we prepared to leave, Gerald made one final attempt to control the narrative. You know, Martha, when you come to your senses and realize you can't handle this alone, don't expect us to welcome you back with open arms. Some bridges once burned can't be rebuilt. His words were meant to frighten me into reconsidering, but they had the opposite effect. They confirmed that my brother saw this as a power struggle rather than a family crisis, and that realization made leaving even easier. Our new house wasn't impressive by anyone's standards. It was a small ranch built in the 1970s with outdated kitchen appliances, bathroom fixtures that needed replacing, and carpet that had seen better decades. But it was ours. Emma and Jake each had their own bedroom for the first time in months, and more importantly, they were the priority in their own home once again. The first night in our new place, I tucked Emma into her bed, surrounded by boxes still waiting to be unpacked. Her room was painted a soft yellow that the previous owner had chosen, and while it wasn't the pink she might have preferred, she told me it reminded her of sunshine and made her happy. Mommy, she said as I kissed her goodnight, I know the house is smaller, but it feels bigger somehow. Does that make sense? It made perfect sense to me. A space where you're valued and loved always feels bigger than a mansion where you're treated as an afterthought. Jake, meanwhile, had already identified the perfect spot for a new garden in our backyard and was making elaborate plans for what he wanted to plant in the spring. His enthusiasm for gardening, which had dimmed so dramatically in the past few months, was already beginning to return. The transition wasn't without challenges. Money was tighter than it had been when we were living with my parents, and I had to carefully budget every expense while still trying to make our house feel like a home. I picked up extra shifts at the hospital when I could, and the children adapted to spending some afternoons with our elderly neighbor, Mrs. Peterson, who welcomed them with homemade cookies and stories about her own grandchildren. But the most remarkable change was in Emma and Jake themselves. Within weeks of our move, Emma's confidence began to return. She started raising her hand in class again, brought home improved grades, and even asked if she could join the school's book club. Jake's joyful, energetic personality re-emerged as he no longer felt the need to constantly monitor his behavior for signs of being too loud or too childish. We established new routines that centered around what Emma and Jake needed, rather than accommodating someone else's requirements. Homework happened at the kitchen table with music playing softly in the background if they wanted it. Bedtime stories were read in silly voices that made them giggle. Weekend mornings were spent making pancakes together with Jake measuring ingredients and Emma flipping them when she felt brave enough to try. 3 months after we moved out, Dad called me at work. His voice sounded older somehow, and I could hear uncertainty where there had once been stubborn conviction. Gerald and Patricia had moved back to their renovated house the week before, and the sudden quiet in my parents' home had given them time to reflect on what had happened. "Martha," he said after some awkward small talk, "your mother and I have been talking, and we think maybe we made some mistakes while Gerald's family was staying with us." I listened as he tried to find words to explain what they had done without fully accepting responsibility for it. It wasn't quite an apology, but it was an acknowledgement that their actions had consequences they hadn't anticipated. He missed Emma and Jake, he said. The house felt empty without children's laughter, and Mom's garden seemed smaller somehow without Jake's enthusiastic help. "The thing is, Dad," I said gently, "it wasn't really about the sleeping arrangements or the space issues. It was about the message you sent to Emma and Jake about their worth. They asked me recently if being regular kids instead of gifted kids meant they weren't good enough for their grandparents anymore. That's not a question children should have to ask." There was a long silence on the phone before Dad spoke again, his voice quieter than I'd ever heard it. "We never meant to make them feel that way, Martha. We love those kids more than life itself. We just got caught up in Leo's achievements and forgot that love isn't supposed to be conditional on performance." It was the closest thing to an admission of wrongdoing I was likely to get from him, and I appreciated the effort it had taken. 6 months later, my parents began making tentative efforts to rebuild their relationships with Emma and Jake. They started with small gestures, birthday cards with handwritten notes, occasional phone calls just to ask about school and friends, invitations to visit that came with no strings attached and no expectations beyond spending time together. The children were cautious at first, understandably hesitant to trust grandparents who had hurt them so deeply. But children are remarkably resilient, and love has a way of healing even the deepest wounds when it's genuine and consistent. Emma eventually accepted an invitation to spend a Saturday afternoon with Grandpa working on a puzzle he'd bought specifically because it featured her favorite animals. Jake started talking to Grandma on the phone about his new garden, sharing pictures of his tomatoes and peppers with someone who remembered teaching him to love growing things. The relationships aren't the same as they were before. There's a wariness now, a protective distance that my children maintain to guard against future disappointment. But there's also love there, the kind of love that can survive mistakes and grow stronger through the process of rebuilding trust. My parents learned that being grandparents isn't about having perfect grandchildren to show off. It's about loving the grandchildren you have exactly as they are. As for Gerald and Patricia, we maintain polite but distant contact. Gerald occasionally sends updates about Leo's continued achievements, and I respond with appropriate enthusiasm while sharing news about Emma and Jake's more modest but equally meaningful accomplishments. We'll never be close, but we found a way to coexist at family gatherings without open hostility. The most important lesson I learned from this experience is that sometimes protecting your children means walking away from people you love, even when it breaks your heart to do it. Emma and Jake needed to know that their mother would fight for them, would choose them, would never allow anyone to treat them as less valuable than they truly are. They needed to understand that their worth isn't determined by their achievements or their compliance, or their ability to impress adults. Today, as I write this story, Emma is 10 years old and thriving in her school's drama program. She discovered she has a talent for acting and a love of performing that brings her genuine joy. Jake, now 8, maintains a garden that produces enough vegetables to share with our neighbors, and he's teaching other kids in our neighborhood about composting and sustainable growing practices. They're not gifted in the traditional academic sense, but they're kind, creative, resilient children who know they are loved unconditionally. Sometimes people ask me if I regret leaving my parents' house, if I wish I had tried harder to work things out, or been more patient with their mistakes. But every time I see Emma perform in a school play or watch Jake carefully tend his plants, I know I made the right choice. My children deserved better than being treated as background characters in someone else's story, and I'm grateful I had the strength to give them the life they deserved. If there's one thing I want other parents to take away from my story, it's this: your children are watching how you respond when they're treated unfairly, and your response teaches them what they should expect from the world. Sometimes the greatest gift you can give your children is showing them that they deserve to be valued and loved exactly as they are, even if it means walking away from family members who can't see their worth. What would you have done in my situation? Have you ever had to choose between keeping peace with family and protecting your children's emotional well-being? Share your thoughts in the comments below, because I'd love to hear your perspective on this challenging situation. If this story resonated with you, please give it a like and subscribe for more real-life stories about family love and the difficult choices we sometimes have to make. Share this video with anyone who might need to hear that they deserve to be treated with respect and dignity, no matter what their age or circumstances. Thank you for listening to my story, and remember that sometimes the bravest thing you can do is walk away from situations that don't honor your worth. Take care of yourselves and the people you love, and I'll see you in the next video.